if it's important to have an idea of what we here in Australia think, what are our values, where do we want to be as a country, if it's important to have a national conversation, a national archive, a place where our own history and humour and music and drama and science and all our public affairs of all kinds is valued, I think it's important to have a well-funded public broadcaster. I mean, if ideas and cultural diversity, if we can think of, say, biodiversity in the same sort of way, the source of different ways of doing things, of thinking about things, of organising themselves, a kind of pool of ideas from which we can replenish ourselves, restore ourselves, when we inevitably come to a dead end in certain kinds of thinking. If this is important, we really need to maintain our Australian point of view. I mean, that's really what is in our charter. It's from our point of view. Otherwise, of course, it's perfectly possible to watch American sitcoms and British comedy shows, and we can watch The Bill till Kingdom Come, and we can count Aussie Big Brother as a nod to Australian content. But it's certainly not the kind of place that I want to live in. We need a place also that is training people in journalism in ways that we don't do anymore. I mean, I do live in the ABC. It feels like I live in the ABC, but I live in a moribund organisation now. I really do have to say that there are people working very, very hard to keep up standards, but it's very, very difficult when you can't bring new people in to the organisation because there are freezers on new blood. You have to sort of select from the same pool of people, and it's sort of moving chairs on the Titanic. You can't fill behind people who are sick or away. It's just getting harder and harder to do a good job. I'm getting a wind-up here. I thought I wouldn't have enough things to say, but I've even got more to say than this. But look, I'm very happy to continue the conversation when you ask me anything.
Thank you, Ramona, and we are not cutting you off. There is a lot we want to explore with Ramona in the conversation. So thank you for that perspective from behind the microphone. Now our third speaker is going to take us into the future a lot more, although of course he has vast experience in the past. Eric Beecher started his career in newspapers as a journalist at The Age in Melbourne, and he has worked as a journalist and an editor. He's worked both here and overseas. He's been editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. He was editor-in-chief of the Herald and Weekly Times. He began the Text Media Group, which he was the founder, the CEO and major shareholder of that very, very valuable organisation, which was then taken over by Fairfax Media in 2003. So Eric then decided to set up Private Media Partners, which acquired Crikey.com, which many of you might be familiar with our daily news reports on Crikey. He's also the major shareholder and founder of 3 other online media ventures, and he will talk a lot about those, I hope, tonight. They are particularly Business Spectator, for example, or the Eureka Report. He is also a journalist who has won a Walkley Award. So there's quite a few Walkley Award winners on the stage today. Eric was awarded the Walkley Award for Journalistic Leadership, and that, of course, is a much coveted award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Beecher.
Okay, so my mission here tonight is to talk about media and journalism in the future. And in a sense, to me, that is to talk about the great paradox. Because on one hand, you have the stories that we've just heard, the alarming decline in journalism, funded journalism in newspapers, questionable decline in public broadcasting. I actually think public broadcasting is pretty healthy, and certainly in a relative sense. There is a structural and endemic decline in most other commercial media now, and that's been accelerated by the current economic downturn. So network television is struggling commercially. Commercial radio makes almost no money anymore. The magazine industry in this country and abroad has suddenly, in the last 6 to 12 months, found itself convulsing, losing enormous swathes of readers and advertisers. And you could go on about all of that, and it's, if anything, getting worse. But it's an incredible paradox, because on the other hand, access to great, or the best and in a global sense, great journalism and media via the internet, and I'm not talking about what I do, I'm talking about in the broadest sense, is unbelievable. I mean, when I look at my favourites in terms of websites and the stuff that I see and read and hear and watch online, it's like nirvana. I mean, it's just unbelievable that, you know, I can get the New York Times a couple of minutes after it's published, and any newspaper I want in the world or magazine. The video content online is getting richer and richer. Every Monday I watch the 3 main American Sunday morning politics shows. The whole thing, live, free. And so there's this amazing paradox that for those of us who consume journalism, which I'm presuming, and media, which I presuming is everybody in this room and most people everywhere, it's never, ever, ever been better or richer or deeper or broader. It's just extraordinary. If you could wind the clock back 10 years or 15 years and someone would have said to you, there's this device on your desk or on your lap or in your hand, and you'll be able to access the best media anywhere in this country or the world, in most cases for nothing, in real time and increasingly in high definition quality, you would have looked at them and said, you're dreaming. So, and the reason I sort of raise this paradox is because the paradox, I think, underpins the great dilemma. The great dilemma being that, on one hand, commercial media is flailing around and failing, and that's because the funding models for commercial media are disappearing. And on the other hand, the availability of great media to everybody, mainly for nothing, is so grand. And so where does that lead us? Now, no one knows where media and journalism is going to be in even 5 years' time, let alone 10 or 20 years' time. And so anything I say or anyone else here says is speculative and problematical, and at least in some part, maybe large part, wrong. But the fact is, the internet, which is the platform for the future in media, that is digital media. I'm not just saying the internet and websites, I'm saying media that is transmitted over digital devices in one form or another. The commercial internet is now 10 or 12 years old, and it's taking shape in a way that is becoming more and more evident. And it's changed a lot, and undoubtedly it will change a lot. And what's obvious is that, what I just said, that increasingly it's somewhere where the best media of all kinds, in all forms, is available. And as it's turning out, in most cases, free of charge, funded by advertising. And so if that continues, the kind of thing that Michael talked about with newspapers, and the same principles are applying to commercial television and to commercial radio and to magazines, not so much to books, because they're not dependent on advertising. As that increases, the unravelling of the commercial media, the traditional commercial media, will accelerate. And as I say, the recession is accelerating that at a much faster rate, and may in fact we may find that over the next 6 to 12 months that the impact of the recession, which is cannibalising advertising revenues because it's a consumer recession, will do what Michael described in newspapers to commercial media. And there's no doubt, as he said, that in America we're already seeing newspapers either closing down or on the verge of closing down. Magazines are closing down. The rationalisation process is well underway. And when you think about the fact that, yes, there'll be fewer newspapers, and yes, there's far less funding for quality journalism, but there's still going to be some of it. And the difference between there being some of it in the pre-internet era and there being some of it now is the internet soaks up and makes available the sum of it. And the sum of it is quite a lot when it's coming from everywhere. So the New York Times and the Guardian and the best newspapers in the world and the best journals and magazines and the best television programming and public broadcasting, if it continues to be funded by governments here and in other countries, some other countries, that will continue. In the pre-internet era, that would have been a tragedy because there would have been only some of it left. In the internet era, in fact, because the internet is this great aggregator and sifter and filter, in fact, as an audience, we can get what we want. We can pick and choose. Now, on the ground in a city like Melbourne or any other developed city in the world, what's happening to our newspapers and our local media is a tragedy. It's a societal tragedy. It's not just a tragedy for journalism and journalists. It's a tragedy for the role and place of journalism in a modern, developed, sophisticated society, and particularly in a democracy. And I personally, whilst I bemoan it, I'm not sure that there's anything we can do, because short of government stepping in and funding high-grade commercial journalism in the way that they fund public broadcasting, and I think that is not just highly unlikely but is almost impossible to imagine, it will, if not disappear, it will fade away. And it's fading away already, as Michael said. You can't produce quality newspapers with 100 fewer journalists, and I have no doubt that over the next 6 months there'll be another tranche of journalists will disappear from places like Fairfax and so on. And so at that level, at the societal level, at the level of the health of the democracy, it is a tragedy. But the interesting thing, and certainly what I would describe as the paradox, is that for the consumers of journalism, particularly on a broader scale than just a local scale, in fact, life has never been better. And even if the Age splutters and the Sydney Morning Herald does and so on, and I'm not a proponent of that happening, I think what's happening is awful and I think it's been appallingly managed. The fact is that the shape of media and journalism in the future, indeed in the present, is one of extraordinary depth and choice. Is that a good thing? Well, at a pure consumption level, yes, it is a good thing. As I say, at a societal and political level, it's a terrible thing, but it's a reality. Mary asked me to talk about the things I do, and also I've got to get a plug in, so I will. I've spent sort of more than 2 decades in the old media, particularly in newspapers. I then got involved in a company that published books and local newspapers and magazines, so it's still print media. And for the last 3 or 4 years I've been involved primarily in online media, both in buying Crikey and developing that, and in starting new, essentially online publications in different niches. And I work in a floor of a building down the road, and we have about 50 or 60 staff, and more than half of them are journalists, and virtually none of them were employed in working for us 2 or 3 years ago. So we're one of the very few places anywhere that's hiring journalists, and we're hiring lots of them, and we're starting new ventures all the time. But we cannot, and we have some really, really high-grade journalists. My partners in Business Spectator, Alan Kohler and Bob Gottliebson and Steve Bartholomew's, are arguably the best 3 business commentators in the country. And we have other really, really good journalists working for our other online publications. But we have a few of them. We don't have hundreds of them, and we don't have a business model that could ever fund hundreds of them. Do we represent the future of media and journalism? Well, we're growing rapidly. The audience for what we do is growing dramatically. You don't hear all that kind of gloom and doom that you heard from Michael in our offices. Quite the opposite. It's vibrant, and it's positive, and it's new, and it's fresh, and it's all of those sort of things. And so to that extent, I think the sort of things we and a few others are doing, not that many unfortunately in this country, although in America and in some other places this kind of thing is now starting to develop. Again, not on a large scale, but there's lots of it. We probably do represent the future of one element of media. And as the old media declines, the new media is coming up. But there is no conception yet of how the new media can replace the old media in terms of the scale of what it does, and in terms of particularly the funding of large-scale journalism. And good journalism requires large scale. It requires lots and lots of people, hundreds of journalists doing all the things that a good newspaper or good journalism in other places does, the ABC and so on. There is no business model, or as yet even glimpse of business model, that can fund that. And that's because old media is funded by advertising, and the advertising revenues of old media, even now in decline, are quite large. So people still pay $30,000 or $40,000 for a full page in The Age. And for us in our media, $30,000 or $40,000 is an enormous amount of money for one person to take one ad. In fact, they buy a lot more than one ad. And so what's happened is that the amount of money being spent on advertising to support the media in the new media is something like 10% of the amount of money in the old media, and that's one of the reasons people use the new media, because it's much cheaper. So yes, there are business models, but they're not as big. And will The Age be replaced by an online equivalent doing the same sorts of things? I can't see that happening, and so I remain sad and pessimistic about the future of large-scale funded journalism outside public broadcasting, which is funded by us, the government. But I remain supremely optimistic about the future for vibrant, more targeted online media doing really good journalism, but on a smaller scale. And I remain optimistic about the fact that as consumers of media and journalism, we've never had it so good, and that's the great paradox.
Thank you, Eric, very much. I think now we've seen and been presented with perspectives from newspaper, from broadcasting, from new online ventures, from journalists and from management. I'd like now to open it up for a general discussion between the four of us, and I'd like to put a proposition to our speakers, and that is my belief that a healthy civic society requires an independent, well-informed fourth estate. and that requires quality content and a form of democratic delivery. Let's start with content. Whether it's old media, emerging media or the new media, has Australia got and can it maintain the ability to produce and disseminate quality content? Okay, Eric.
See, I think in one sense that's a motherhood question. We all want that to happen. I think the problem with these discussions is to separate, if you like, ideology or even sincerity from commerce. And commerce is a grubby thing, and commerce is something we'd rather not think about, like making sausages. But the fact is, commerce funds quality media, except for public broadcasting. And in that case, we're dependent, as Ramona has been saying, on the politicians. And at the moment in Australia, the ABC and SBS are funded to the extent of, I don't know, 800 million a year or something.
The ABC about 800.
So $1 billion with SBS, close to it, 900 million. My concern would be in the current economic climate, and if the politics change and so on, you know, it would be so easy for them to slice that. So that's the public broadcasting equation. It's not commerce in the sense that they have to sell advertising or sell products, but it's funding. And so, yes, in a decent civic society we need that. Do we have it in Australia? Well, we only have it if it's funded. And I think that the debate and the focus should be much more on the funding, even though that's not necessarily something that most of us are interested in, because if you don't have the funding, you don't have the quality. End of story.
But surely quality is, and that's what I expected someone to take up, what do you mean by quality? Because quality, for example, to Rupert Murdoch on the Wall Street Journal might be different to the sort of quality that someone requires from the Times of London, or indeed from The Age, or indeed from Crikey. So quality is not a pejorative word, but it is a word that has a different answer depending on who you ask the question of. But there is a sense that to produce quality, whether it's for a business online magazine or whether it's for a book show, does require certain skills and indeed some training. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, can I just say on this question of quality, I frankly don't know what it means. I haven't known what it means ever since it became an issue. You know, when I started in journalism, I've said this before, I can't remember much talk about quality. I can't even remember much talk about quality. The Age at one stage was considered, you know, one of the 10 best newspapers in the world. I always thought that was a bit exaggerated, mind you. I don't know.
It was in a book, though. It was in a book.
It was in a book, yeah. But I can't remember much talk about what's quality and how do we produce quality and what is... Look,
but you used to talk about newspaper of record.
No, we talked about, does this newspaper know its audience and talk to its audience? That's what commercial... And is it trusted? Of course. I think that, for instance, the Herald, the Sun News Pictorial, when I was a journalist, was in its own way as good a newspaper as The Age. It knew its audience. It spoke to it. It was trusted by its audience. It sold 750,000 copies a day. It wasn't a rag. It was a newspaper with basically for working class people who trusted it and believed it. Was that a quality newspaper? I think it was a quality newspaper. It was a quality newspaper because it knew and related to its audience. I think that so. But when I talk about the need for a new newspaper, I am talking about a newspaper that has a particular audience in mind. And what is that audience? That audience are those people that listen to Ramona's book program, that are ABC listeners, more Radio National than local radio, which I think is full of a lot of nonsense a lot of the time, aping commercial radio in a way that it ought not to be doing. So there is, I have an audience in mind. I have the audience that, and you can actually do figures. There are about, in Melbourne, say, and because I've looked at this, there's an audience for the sort of paper that's interested in politics, in culture, sport, and business, done in a certain way. That audience, I reckon there are around a potential readership of around 300,000 or 400,000 for that, if we would do it right, with a circulation for that sort of paper of around 100,000.
Well, let me be a little bit provocative.
Could I just say something about sort of the idea of this content and the sort of the idea of the importance for a democratic or a civil society, and just harking back to what Eric said. I mean, yes, we read the New York Times. Yes, we read the Times Literary Supplement. It's fantastic. It's exciting. But who is going to break a story about a scandal in Melbourne, if not The Age or the local, the Herald Sun or the Australian newspaper?
Crikey.
Or Crikey. Well, not so much Crikey. I mean, Crikey hasn't got, we've just heard, hasn't got a whole lot of people on the beats walking around doing all kinds of investigative work, has it? I mean, you just said you're a much smaller...
Because Crikey's online, it has the other model, which is the participant model. And
sure, but you get an email from someone saying this is the latest thing. You should have a look at this. Well, who is that person? We don't know. We don't know what barrel they've got to push. I mean, you really, there's a lot of work you need to do before you just broadcast something that someone's sent in to you.
Well, and we do that work.
Sure, but you must admit, I mean, it's all exciting to read the overseas things online, but, it's the foot sloggers in your own town, in your own community, who are going to tell your own stories. They're not going to review books, Australian writers in the New York Times.
No one argues with that, Ramona. What I'm saying is we can say that's really good, we all believe in it, we all love it, but if someone doesn't pay for it, the foot sloggers don't slog.
Well, that's right. But it's not that exciting then to read the New York Times. It's not going to help us as a civic society if there's absolute, something rotten in our own core that we can't even tell, we don't know about because we haven't thought it important enough to keep our good journalism going locally.
Well, I think that's the point I was trying to make, that newspapers have been developed into kind of civic institutions. That's what they became, and they did this by forming communities of readers.